A mountain man lived alone for 30 years, until a woman with 2 boys arrived saying, "You're their father." Out in the frozen high timber, a lonely cabin door swings open, and the quietest man in the mountains finds 2 frightened boys staring up at him, calling him Pa. A church bell echoes in the distance. Hooves strike the snow-packed trail. Something dangerous is coming. Because this woman isn't here for shelter alone. She's running from a gang that believes this mountain hermit holds the key to a deadly weapon. And the words she spoke on his doorstep weren't the truth. Behind her lies fear. Behind him lies a past he swore he'd never face. When bullets start flying and the boys cling to him with all they have left, the old life he buried threatens to rise again. Now the mountains shake with secrets, lies, and a bond neither side expected. If he isn't their father, why is he willing to die for them? And when the truth finally comes out, will it save this new family or tear them apart forever? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The mountain air bit sharp and clean as Roman Ward moved through his morning routine, each action worn smooth by years of solitude. Steam rose from the tin coffee pot on his wood stove, carrying the rich scent of fresh grounds through his cabin. The familiar aroma mixed with the crisp pine that drifted through the gaps in the log walls, a scent that had been his only companion for longer than he cared to count. He pulled on his worn leather boots, laces stiff with frost, and stepped out onto the porch. The early morning light painted the snow-laden branches in shades of pearl and gold. Roman's practiced eye surveyed his trapline markers in the distance, small flags of red cloth that dotted the white landscape like drops of blood on fresh linen. The broken stovepipe needed fixing before the next storm rolled in. Roman retrieved his tools from the lean-to, the metal cold against his calloused hands. As he worked, the rhythmic tapping of his hammer echoed off the surrounding pines. The sound of his solitary labor was so familiar that at first he almost missed it, the creak and groan of wagon wheels laboring up his trail. Roman froze, hammer suspended mid-swing. Nobody came up this far without purpose, and unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. He set his tools down slowly and moved inside to retrieve his lantern, lighting it with careful movements that betrayed none of the tension gathering in his shoulders. The wagon's approach was halting, uncertain. Roman could hear the wheels struggling against the rutted, snow-packed trail. He stepped off his porch, holding the lantern high, its glow catching the swirling flakes that had begun to fall. Through the gentle curtain of snow, a small wagon emerged from the trees. The horse was lathered despite the cold, steam rising from its flanks. At the reins sat a woman, her shape obscured by a heavy shawl. 2 small figures huddled against her, all 3 trembling visibly in the pre-dawn chill. The woman's hands shook as she drew the wagon to a stop. In the lantern light, Roman could see she was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with dark hair escaping from beneath a worn bonnet. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes held a desperate determination that made him step back. "Are you Roman Ward?" Her voice quavered, but carried clearly in the still morning air. Roman nodded slowly. "I am." She swallowed hard, then spoke words that shattered the quiet of his mountain morning like a gunshot. "These are your sons." The statement hung in the frigid air between them. Roman stared at the 2 boys pressed against her sides. The older one, perhaps 10 years old, met his gaze with wary eyes that seemed too old for his young face. The younger boy, who couldn't have been more than 7, peered at Roman with undisguised curiosity despite his obvious fatigue. "That's not possible," Roman said, his voice rough with disuse and disbelief. The woman, who would later introduce herself as Madeline Hale, climbed down from the wagon with stiff movements. Her boots crunched in the snow as she helped the boys down. They clung to her skirts, the older one positioning himself slightly in front of his brother. "Please," Madeline said, and something in her voice made Roman look closer at their faces. The boys were watching him with wide, frightened eyes that reflected the lantern light. Something twisted in his chest as he noticed the older boy's straight nose, the younger one's set of his jaw, features that struck uncomfortable chords of recognition. The wind picked up, carrying more snow, and the younger boy shivered visibly. Roman found himself speaking before he'd fully formed the thought. "Come inside. Whatever this is about, it's too cold to discuss it out here." Relief flooded Madeline's face. She herded the boys toward the cabin, her hands gentle on their shoulders. Roman held the door, watching as they filed past him into the warmth of his home. The space that had seemed adequate for one man suddenly felt cramped with 4 people in it. "Sit by the stove," he said, gesturing to the bench he'd built years ago. "I'll add more wood." As he built up the fire, he could hear them settling, the rustle of clothing, the younger boy's whispered question to his mother, quickly hushed. The coffee pot still steamed on the stovetop, and Roman found himself automatically reaching for extra cups, though he owned only 2. He'd have to share with the boys. "Are you hungry?" he asked, more gruffly than he'd intended. "Yes, sir," the younger boy piped up before his mother could answer. "We ate our last biscuit yesterday morning." Roman turned to his cupboard, grateful for the excuse to hide his face. He pulled out the remains of a loaf of bread, some dried venison, and the last of his preserved peaches. It wasn't much of a meal, but it was what he had. The boys ate like they were starving, which they probably were. The younger one, Jonah, he learned, chattered between bites about their journey, while his brother Luke remained watchful and silent. Madeline barely touched her food, her eyes darting between Roman and her sons. As the boys' eating slowed, their exhaustion became more apparent. Jonah's head began to droop, and even Luke's vigilant posture softened. Roman pulled some blankets from his trunk and laid them near the hearth. "They need rest," he said to Madeline. She nodded gratefully and helped the boys settle. Within minutes, they were both asleep, their faces peaceful in the firelight. Roman waited until their breathing had deepened into the rhythm of sleep before he turned to Madeline. "Now," he said quietly, "you need to tell me what this is really about." She followed him to the far corner of the cabin, where they could talk without disturbing the boys. In the dim light, her face showed every mile of their journey, every worry line etched deeper by whatever had driven her to his door. "I didn't want to lie," she whispered, her hands twisting in her skirts. "But I had no choice." Roman felt his jaw tighten. "So you admit it's a lie?" "The boys aren't yours by blood," she acknowledged, her voice barely audible. "But I needed them to believe they were, at least until I could explain everything to you." She glanced at the sleeping children, then back to Roman, her eyes pleading. "Please, let me explain why we're here, why I had to find you." Roman looked at the boys sleeping by his hearth, boys who had believed they were meeting their father, who had climbed this mountain through snow and cold, led by a desperate woman's lie. He should feel angry, he thought, should feel used. Instead, he felt something else entirely, something that made his chest ache as he watched Jonah burrow deeper into the blankets, as Luke's hand reached out in sleep to protect his brother. "Start at the beginning," he said finally, his voice low and controlled. "And tell me the truth this time." Madeline drew a shaky breath, her fingers still working at her skirts. In the firelight, tears gleamed in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She opened her mouth to begin her story, the truth she'd held back finally ready to spill forth. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cabin that had known only one man's solitude for so long. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering their tracks, while inside, 4 lives hung suspended in the moment before truth could change everything. Madeline's fingers twisted in her skirts as she looked up at Roman. The firelight cast deep shadows across her face, highlighting the exhaustion etched there. "The truth is," she whispered, "the boys aren't yours. I'm sorry for the lie, but I needed to make sure you'd at least hear us out before turning us away." Roman's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, waiting. "We're running from a man named Vern Caro," she continued, her voice trembling. "He leads a gang that's been terrorizing the valley settlements. They're not just ordinary outlaws. They're after something specific." She paused, glancing at Roman. "They're after you." Roman's expression didn't change, but his hands, resting on the rough-hewn table, curled into fists. "Why?" "Caro believes you're the only gunsmith capable of forging a special rifle, one that can shoot farther and more accurately than any other." Madeline's voice dropped even lower. "He says it's called the Ward Long Rifle." The name hung in the air between them. Roman's face had gone pale, his eyes distant with old memories. "How did Caro find out about me?" The question came out harsh, barely above a whisper. "He's been gathering information for months, tracking down anyone who might know about the rifle. When he learned I was a widow with healing knowledge, skills that let me travel between settlements without suspicion." She swallowed hard. "He gave me a choice. Either I help him find you, or—" Her eyes drifted to the boys sleeping peacefully by the hearth. Luke had thrown one arm protectively across his younger brother, even in sleep. Jonah's face was softened by firelight, making him look even younger than his 7 years. Roman followed her gaze. "He threatened the children." It wasn't a question, but Madeline nodded. "He gave me 3 months to find you. Said if I failed, he'd—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I've been searching the mountains for weeks, following rumors, asking careful questions. When I finally found someone who knew where you lived..." She spread her hands helplessly. "I had to make you listen, had to make you understand." "By lying about the boys?" There was an edge to Roman's voice now. "I'm not proud of it," Madeline said quietly. "But yes, I knew if you thought they were yours, you'd at least let us in out of the snow. Give me a chance to explain." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Would you have helped us otherwise? A stranger with 2 young boys, bringing trouble to your door?" Roman turned away, moving to the window. Outside, the snow was falling heavier now, thick flakes swirling in the darkness. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the pop and crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the sleeping children. Finally, he spoke without turning around. "You can stay until morning. The trail's too dangerous in the dark, especially with this snow." "Thank you," Madeline whispered. "I know we're asking too much." "Get some rest," Roman cut her off. "We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." He watched as she settled herself near the boys, pulling a corner of the blanket over herself. Soon her breathing joined theirs in the rhythm of exhausted sleep. Roman stayed by the window, his thoughts as turbulent as the storm outside. The night passed slowly. Roman didn't sleep, instead feeding the fire and watching his unexpected guests. Every so often, one of the boys would stir, Jonah mumbling in his sleep, Luke shifting closer to his brother. Despite his anger at Madeline's deception, Roman found himself studying their faces, noting details he'd missed earlier. Luke's serious expression, even in sleep, spoke of a child forced to grow up too quickly. Jonah's tousled hair and slightly crooked collar revealed a boy still clinging to childhood despite their circumstances. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows, Roman pulled on his heavy coat. He needed to check his trap lines, yes, but more importantly, he needed space to think. The cold air bit at his face as he stepped outside, the fresh snow crunching under his boots. The morning was still and clear after the storm, the mountain air sharp in his lungs. As he worked his way along the trap line, Roman wrestled with his thoughts. He should send them away. It was the sensible thing to do. He'd left that life behind decades ago, buried the gunsmith with the last rifle he'd ever forged. He had no obligation to these strangers, this woman who'd lied to him, these boys who... The image of Luke's protective arm across his brother flashed through Roman's mind. He remembered being that age, trying to protect someone smaller, weaker. Remembered failing. When Roman returned to the cabin, the scene that greeted him stopped him in the doorway. Luke was carefully sweeping the floor with his too-big broom, while Jonah struggled to fold the blankets they'd used. Madeline stood at the stove, stirring something that smelled like breakfast. "Good morning, Mr. Ward," Jonah called out cheerfully. "Mama found some oats in your cupboard. She says they'll make a proper breakfast once they're cooked up." Luke said nothing, but his eyes met Roman's steadily as he continued sweeping. There was something in that look, determination, perhaps, or hope, that tugged at something long buried in Roman's chest. "You didn't have to do that," Roman said gruffly, hanging his coat by the door. "We wanted to help," Luke spoke up quietly, "since you let us stay." Roman watched as the boy returned to his sweeping, his movements careful and deliberate. These children, he realized, had known nothing but running and hiding, yet here they were, trying to make themselves useful, trying to belong. The quiet moment shattered as a sharp crack echoed through the valley below. Roman was at the window in 2 strides, his body tense. In the distance, a thin trail of smoke rose above the trees. "Gunshot," he said grimly, turning to find Madeline already gathering the boys close, her face pale with fear. "Seems your trouble's found its way up the mountain." The oats bubbled forgotten on the stove as all 4 stared out the window, watching that ominous thread of smoke rise into the crystal-clear mountain morning. The peaceful routine they'd begun to establish crumbled in the face of approaching danger, leaving them frozen in a moment of shared dread. Luke's hand found his brother's, squeezing tight. Jonah pressed closer to his mother, his earlier cheerfulness replaced by wide-eyed fear. And Roman, watching them, felt the weight of a decision settling onto his shoulders. A decision that would shatter the solitude he'd built around himself like armor, all because of a woman's desperate lie and 2 boys who reminded him too much of ghosts from his past. The mountain air bit sharp and clean as Roman stepped onto his front porch the next morning. Fresh snow blanketed everything in pristine white, but the sky had cleared to a deep winter blue. He watched Madeline and the boys emerge from the cabin, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. "First thing's needed is warmth," Roman said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Can't think straight when you're cold. Luke, you're tall enough to stack wood. Jonah can gather kindling. Ma'am, if you'll help me with the larger logs." Madeline nodded, pulling her shawl tighter. "We're grateful for the work, Mr. Ward. Keeps the blood flowing." Roman demonstrated proper lifting technique as they began moving firewood from the pile to the covered porch. He watched carefully as Luke mimicked his movements, noting how the boy's thin arms trembled under even modest loads. "Smaller pieces for now," Roman advised, reducing Luke's burden. "Build your strength first." Luke's face flushed with embarrassment, but he nodded, determination evident in his squared shoulders. Jonah darted about like a sparrow, gathering fallen twigs and small branches with surprising enthusiasm. "Look, Mama," he called out, holding up a particularly straight stick. "This one's perfect." "Mind where you step," Madeline cautioned, but Roman caught the ghost of a smile on her face, the first he'd seen since their arrival. The morning passed in steady work. Roman assessed their capabilities through various tasks, sorting kindling, carrying water from the creek, helping to check the closer trap lines. The boys worked without complaint, though their cityfied manners showed in their awkward handling of tools and uncertain footing on the snowy ground. Just before noon, the distant sound of hoofbeats drew Roman's attention. He gestured for Madeline and the boys to move behind the woodpile, then stepped forward to meet the approaching rider. The man who appeared on the trail was familiar, Silas Kipp, a rancher from the valley below. His horse's flanks were flecked with snow, suggesting a hard ride up the mountain. "Morning, Roman," Silas called out, reining his horse to a stop. His weather-beaten face was creased with concern. "Thought you ought to know. Got some strange folks asking questions down in the valley." Roman's expression didn't change, but his shoulders tensed. "What kind of questions?" "Specific ones." Silas dismounted, leading his horse closer. "About a woman traveling with 2 boys. And about you, by name. They're asking if anyone knows where to find Roman Ward, the gunsmith." Behind the woodpile, Madeline drew her boys closer, her face pale. Roman kept his voice steady. "Been a long time since anyone's called me that." "That's what I told them," Silas nodded. "Said I knew Roman Ward the trapper, nothing about any gunsmithing. But they're persistent, Roman. Mean-looking bunch, led by a fellow named Caro. Been showing silver around the saloon trying to loosen tongues." "Much obliged for the warning," Roman said carefully. "Any idea which way they're headed?" "They were asking about the mountain trails yesterday. I came up as soon as I heard." Silas glanced around, lowering his voice. "You in some kind of trouble, Roman?" "No trouble," Roman answered, perhaps too quickly. "Just prefer my privacy, as you know." Silas studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Well, if you need anything..." He left the offer hanging, then mounted his horse. "Watch yourself, friend. Those men, there's something not right about them." Roman watched until Silas disappeared down the trail, then turned toward the woodpile. Madeline emerged slowly, her face drawn with worry. The boys pressed close to her sides. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I never meant to bring this to your door. We can leave, try to..." "No." Roman's voice was firm. "Those boys won't last a day in this weather, not in their condition." He looked at Luke and Jonah, noting their hollow cheeks and the way their clothes hung loose. "You'll stay until you've got some strength back, at least." Relief and gratitude flooded Madeline's face. "Mr. Ward, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't." Roman cut her off, but without harshness. "Just help with the work. There's plenty needs doing." As afternoon settled into evening, Roman showed them essential skills for mountain survival. He demonstrated proper axe technique to Luke, guiding the boys' hands as they split smaller logs for kindling. "Keep your stance wide," he instructed. "Let the weight of the axe do the work." Luke's face screwed up in concentration as he attempted to copy Roman's movements. Jonah proved to have a talent for fire tending, carefully arranging kindling just as Roman showed him. "Like building a little house," the boy explained seriously, "with a door for the air to come in." Madeline worked steadily alongside them, her capable hands quickly learning the rhythm of mountain chores. Roman found himself impressed by her quiet competence, though the memory of her deception still nagged at him. As darkness fell, They gathered around the table for a simple supper of bean stew and cornbread. The warm food and honest work had brought color to the boys' cheeks, and even Madeline seemed less tense than before. Luke pushed his empty bowl away, then glanced shyly at Roman. "Mr. Ward?" he asked, his voice quiet but clear. "Is it true what Mama said? That you used to build rifles?" The cabin grew suddenly still. Roman's face, hardened, old shadows crossing his features. "That was a long time ago," he said shortly, standing to clear the dishes. "Best focus on present things." Luke's face fell slightly, but he nodded, helping to gather the bowls without further questions. Roman stepped outside onto the porch, needing a moment of space from the crowded cabin. The night air was sharp with coming frost, stars pricking bright holes in the black sky. Roman's practiced eye scanned the valley below, checking for any sign of movement. There, far down the trail, barely visible in the growing darkness, 3 riders moved slowly through the trees, their direction clear. They were heading up the mountain. Roman stood motionless, watching until the riders disappeared into the shadows. Inside the cabin, he could hear Madeline's soft voice as she settled the boys for sleep, their presence both a burden and a growing responsibility he hadn't sought. But as he thought of Caro's men drawing closer, Roman knew the choice had already been made. These people, this woman and her sons, were under his protection now, whether he'd wanted it or not. The weight of that decision settled over him like a heavy blanket as he watched the valley below, where somewhere in the darkness, danger was slowly but surely making its way toward his mountain sanctuary. Roman woke well before the pale winter sun could peek over the mountain ridges. The cabin's interior remained dark except for the dying embers in the hearth, casting a faint orange glow across the sleeping forms of Madeline and her boys. They were huddled together under the thick quilts he'd provided, their breaths slow and steady in the pre-dawn quiet. He moved silently through his morning routine, pulling on his heavy boots and wool coat. The floorboards threatened to creak under his weight, but years of living alone had taught him which spots to avoid. At the door, he paused, considering whether to wake them. The ridge needed scouting, but leaving them unaware and unprotected gnawed at him. Safety won out over stealth. Roman approached Madeline's sleeping form and touched her shoulder gently. "Ma'am," he whispered. Her eyes flew open instantly, arms tightening around her boys. Even in sleep, she remained alert to danger. The wariness in her expression eased slightly when she recognized him. "Need to check the ridge," Roman explained quietly. "Stay inside, keep low, and bar the door behind me. Don't open it unless you hear my signal. 3 quick knocks, then 2 slow." Madeline nodded, already fully awake. She nudged Luke and Jonah gently. "Boys," she whispered, "time to get up. We need to be extra quiet this morning." The boys stirred, blinking in confusion at the darkness. Luke caught on first, pressing a finger to his lips to quiet his younger brother before Jonah could ask questions. Roman felt a flutter of approval at their quick understanding. Once they were all up, Roman checked his rifle. More habit than intention, as he hadn't fired it at anything but game in years. He demonstrated the door's heavy bar to Madeline, making sure she could manage its weight alone. "I'll be back before mid-morning," he promised. "If anyone approaches, we'll stay silent and hidden," Madeline finished. "We've had practice." The edge of bitterness in her voice made Roman wonder just how long they'd been running from Caro's gang. Outside, the mountain air bit sharp and clean. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, perfect for tracking, but that worked both ways. Roman moved carefully, placing his feet in the shadows of trees and rocks where he could. The ridge above his cabin offered the best vantage point of the surrounding valleys, and that's where he headed first. The climb took longer than usual. Roman stopped frequently to scan his surroundings, checking for any sign of intrusion into his territory. Near the top, he found what he was looking for, and dreading. Fresh tracks crossed his path, boot prints less than a day old heading east along the ridge. They'd been made by someone trying to move quietly, staying just below the skyline where they wouldn't be silhouetted against the dawn. Roman followed the tracks cautiously until he reached his usual lookout point. From here, he could see for miles across the lower canyons. The early morning light painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, but Roman's eyes were drawn to a thin column of smoke rising from a sheltered hollow about 2 miles below. No one camped in these mountains in winter without good reason. The smoke's location was too perfectly placed, close enough to watch the main trail to his cabin, far enough to avoid immediate detection. Roman counted at least 3 separate campfires, suggesting a larger group than just the riders they'd spotted yesterday. He stayed at the lookout long enough to verify no one was actively approaching the cabin, then made his way back down. The sun had fully risen by the time he reached home, casting long shadows through the trees. He gave the signal knock, and Madeline quickly unbarred the door. The boys looked up from where they sat at the table, faces tight with worry. The cabin smelled of coffee and warming biscuits. Madeline had kept busy during his absence. "There's a camp," Roman said without preamble, 2 miles down in Bear Hollow, multiple fires. Madeline's hands trembled slightly as she poured him a cup of coffee. "Caro?" "Most likely. They're watching the trail." Roman accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "We'll need to stay close to the cabin for now. No smoke during daylight hours. It shows too clear against the snow." "What can we do to help?" Luke asked, his young voice determined despite the fear Roman could see in his eyes. Roman considered the boys' questions seriously. Keeping them occupied would help manage their anxiety, and there was always work to be done. "Plenty of tasks need doing," he said. "Start with the tack. Saddles and harnesses need mending before spring comes." He brought out his repair kit and showed the boys how to clean and condition the leather, how to watch for weak spots and reinforce them with careful stitching. Luke took to it quickly, his smaller fingers managing the detailed work better than Roman's weathered hands ever had. Even Jonah helped, gathering supplies and sorting the different types of leather strips. Madeline moved around them quietly, preparing a hearty stew from Roman's winter stores. The familiar domestic sounds, the bubble of the pot, the scrape of the wooden spoon, the boys' occasional whispered questions, created an illusion of normalcy that almost let Roman forget the danger lurking below. The illusion shattered shortly after noon. The sound came first, hard hoofbeats approaching at a gallop, someone pushing their horse too fast for the snowy conditions. Roman had his rifle in hand before the rider appeared, but he recognized the horse, one of Ted Morrison's ranch hands, young Billy Cooper. The boy practically fell from his saddle, face red from cold and exertion. "Mr. Ward," he gasped. "They've got Mr. Morrison." Roman helped steady the boy, while Madeline quickly brought him water. Billy gulped it down, then continued breathlessly. "Caro's men. They took him this morning. Said they had a message for you." The cold in Roman's gut had nothing to do with the winter air. "What message?" "They're holding him at the Morrison Ranch. Said you got 3 days to come down and meet with Caro, or—" Billy swallowed hard. "Or they'll kill Mr. Morrison. Said to tell you they know you're harboring that woman and her kids, and this is your only chance to end things peaceful." Roman's jaw tightened. Ted Morrison was a good man, one of the few neighbors who'd ever shown Roman genuine kindness. The thought of him in Caro's hands. "Did they hurt him?" Roman asked quietly. Billy shook his head. "Not yet. But Mr. Ward, there's at least 8 of them. Maybe more. All armed. Mr. Morrison told me to run for help, but the sheriff's away in Denver, won't be back for a week. Behind them, Madeline made a small sound of distress. Roman turned to find her holding her boys close, face pale with guilt and fear. She knew as well as he did that this escalation was because of them, because she'd brought Caro's obsession with the legendary rifle to his doorstep. But looking at those boys, at Luke's brave attempt to hide his trembling, at Jonah's complete trust in his mother's embrace, Roman couldn't find it in himself to blame them. They were innocent in all this, caught in the schemes of violent men. "Billy," Roman said, "ride back down. Tell Ted's wife I received the message. Don't tell anyone else you came here." The young ranch hand nodded earnestly. "Yes, sir. What else should I say?" Roman's voice was heavy with the weight of decision. "Tell her to have faith. Ted Morrison won't die because of this." After Billy departed, Roman stood for a long time on his porch, staring down the mountain toward where he knew Caro waited. The quiet life he'd built here, the peace he'd found in solitude, it was all slipping away like snow melting in spring thaw. He turned back to find Luke and Jonah watching him through the cabin window, their small faces solemn with understanding beyond their years. They knew, as children always seem to know, that everything was about to change. The responsibility settled over Roman like a heavy cloak, not just for Ted Morrison's life, but for these boys who needed protection, for their mother who'd had nowhere else to turn, for the oath he'd sworn years ago never to forge another weapon of death. The weight of it all pressed down, forcing him to acknowledge that his days of hiding from the world were over. Dawn broke cold and clear over the mountain cabin. Roman stood at his window, watching the first rays of sunlight paint the snow-covered branches in shades of gold. He'd made his decision during the long, sleepless night. They needed help, and Reverend Porter was the wisest man he knew in these parts. Inside the cabin, Madeline moved quietly, preparing a simple breakfast of cornbread and coffee. The boys sat at the rough-hewn table, their eyes following Roman's movements as he checked his rifle and gathered supplies for the journey. "It'll take most of the day to reach town," Roman explained, his voice low. "The trail's steep, and we'll need to rest the horses halfway down." He paused, studying their faces. "You sure you're up for this?" Madeline nodded, her hands steady as she wrapped the remaining cornbread for their journey. "We can't hide forever," she said softly, "and Mr. Morrison needs help." Roman helped them load the wagon, making sure the boys were wrapped warmly in extra blankets he'd stored away. The morning air bit sharp and clean as they set out, the wagon's wheels creaking against the frozen ground. Roman rode alongside on his horse, constantly scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of trouble. The descent from his mountain sanctuary was slow-going. Roman chose the longer, less direct route, avoiding the main trail where Caro's men might be watching. The boys remained unusually quiet, sensing the tension in the adults. Only occasionally would Jonah point out a deer or fox crossing their path, his whispered excitement bringing brief smiles to their faces. By midday, they reached a sheltered meadow where Roman called a halt. The horses needed rest, their flanks steaming in the cold air. While Madeline helped the boys stretch their legs, Roman checked the surrounding area, making sure they were truly alone. "Your boys handled the trail well," he commented when he returned, the words slipping out before he could catch himself. Madeline's cheeks colored slightly at the possessive term, but she simply nodded her thanks. They shared a cold lunch of cornbread and dried apples, the boys huddling, close to their mother for warmth. Roman found himself watching them, noting how Luke's protective stance over his younger brother mirrored his own instincts. These weren't his sons, he reminded himself firmly. But something in his chest tightened whenever he saw their trust in him. The afternoon brought them down into more populated country. They passed scattered homesteads where curious faces appeared in windows, watching the unusual sight of Roman Ward traveling with a woman and children. Roman kept his expression neutral, but he could feel the weight of speculation growing with each mile. The small church settlement came into view as the sun began its westward slide. It wasn't much. A weathered wooden church, a few surrounding buildings, and Reverend Porter's modest home, but it represented civilization after the isolation of Roman's mountain retreat. Already, he could see people gathering to watch their approach, whispering among themselves. "Look at those boys," he heard someone say as they passed. "Spitting image of Roman Ward when he was young." Madeline's cheeks flushed deep red, but she kept her eyes forward, her hands tight on the wagon reins. The boys seemed to shrink under the attention, pressing closer to their mother's sides. Roman led them directly to the church, where Reverend Porter stood waiting on the steps. The preacher was a tall, lean man with kind eyes and graying hair, someone Roman had always respected for his quiet wisdom and fair judgment. "Roman," Porter greeted him warmly. "It's been too long." His gaze took in Madeline and the boys with gentle curiosity but no obvious surprise. "Reverend," Roman replied with a slight nod. "Need your counsel if you have time." "Of course." Porter turned to Madeline with a welcoming smile. "Mrs. Hale, I presume? Please come inside where it's warm. The boys, too." Inside the church, Porter listened silently as Roman explained their situation. Caro's threats, Morrison's capture, and the impossible choice they now faced. He carefully avoided mentioning the rifle that had started it all, but Porter's shrewd eyes suggested he understood more than was being said. "Caro's influence runs deep," the preacher said finally, his voice grave. "He has connections with certain railroad interests that give him protection from local law." He paused, considering. "But the reservation agency might help. They've been watching Caro's activities with concern, especially his treatment of native families in the valley." Roman nodded slowly, absorbing this information. The reservation agency was a day's ride west. Possible help, but not in time to save Morrison. "For tonight," Porter continued, "you're welcome to use the church bunkhouse. It's simple, but warm and dry." The bunkhouse was a long, low building behind the church, used mainly during revival meetings. Inside, they found clean straw mattresses and wool blankets. Madeline got the boys settled, while Roman checked the building's security, noting the thin walls and multiple windows with concern. Outside, he could hear the murmur of voices as townspeople gathered in small groups, sharing the day's excitement. The words drifted clearly through the wooden walls. "Did you see those boys? Has to be Roman Ward's sons. Never knew he had a family. Explains why he's lived alone all these years." Roman lay on his narrow bunk, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling beams. Across the room, he could hear the boys' soft breathing, already deep in exhausted sleep. Madeline's bunk was silent, but he doubted she was sleeping either. The whispers continued outside. "Roman Ward finally has a family." The words seemed to echo in the darkness, carrying a weight of expectation he wasn't sure he could bear. He'd spent decades building walls around his life, protecting others from the violence that seemed to follow his name. Now those walls were crumbling, and he couldn't tell if it was destruction or deliverance approaching. Luke mumbled something in his sleep, a small, vulnerable sound that made Roman's chest ache. Not his sons, he reminded himself again. But as the whispers faded into the night, he knew it was already too late. His heart had made its own decision, regardless of blood. The first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Roman hitched the horses to the wagon. His breath formed clouds in the crisp morning air while he worked, double-checking the harnesses with practiced hands. Behind him, the church bunkhouse door creaked open as Madeline emerged with the boys, all three bundled against the cold. "The reservation agency's a good 4 hours west," Roman explained, helping them climb aboard. "Trail's easier than yesterday's mountain path, but still rough in spots." Luke and Jonah huddled close to their mother on the wagon seat, sharing a blanket against the morning chill. Roman mounted his horse, scanning the quiet town before leading them toward the western trail. A few early risers watched them leave, but the whispers from the previous night had mercifully faded with the darkness. The frost-hardened trail crunched beneath the wagon wheels and hooves as they made their way across the valley. The morning sun slowly warmed their backs, and the boys gradually relaxed enough to point out interesting sights: a hawk circling overhead, a family of deer browsing in a distant meadow, the glint of ice on a stream. "Look there," Roman said, gesturing toward a line of cottonwoods marking a creek bed. "That water feeds half the ranches in this valley. Same with all these little streams. They're what keeps the land alive." "Is that why Mr. Caro wants them?" Luke asked quietly, showing his usual keen understanding. Roman nodded, impressed by the boy's perception. "Reckon so? Man who controls the water controls everything else." They stopped briefly at mid-morning to rest the horses and share some breakfast. Roman noticed how Jonah stayed close to him while they ate, asking innocent questions about the plants and animals they'd seen. The boy's trust touched something deep inside him, something he'd thought long buried. By midday, they reached the reservation agency, a collection of wooden buildings surrounded by a sturdy fence. A flag snapped in the winter wind above the main office. 2 soldiers stood guard at the gate, but they recognized Roman from his occasional trading visits and waved them through. "Mr. Ward," Sergeant Lewis greeted them, emerging from his office. He was a weathered man with keen eyes and a reputation for fairness. "Didn't expect to see you down from your mountain this time of year." Roman made brief introductions, then asked for a private word. While Madeline and the boys waited in the wagon, he followed Lewis into his office. "Caro's been busy," Lewis said grimly, spreading a map across his desk. "See these marks? Each one's a complaint about his men pressuring settlers. They're working their way systematically through the valley, focusing on properties near water sources." Roman studied the pattern of marks, his jaw tightening. "He's trying to control the whole region." "Through fear and force," Lewis confirmed. "The rifle he wants from you, that's just part of it. With a weapon that accurate, his men could control key points throughout the valley. Nobody could move without his permission." "And the law?" Roman asked, though he already knew the answer. Lewis's face darkened. "Caro's got friends in the railroad office. They want the water rights too, for their planned expansion. They're happy to look the other way while he does their dirty work." Roman felt the weight of this new understanding settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about him anymore, or even about Madeline and the boys. Caro's ambitions threatened every honest settler in the valley. The return journey was quieter, each adult lost in their own thoughts. The boys seemed to sense the tension, speaking in whispers as they watched the landscape roll past. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail when Luke finally broke the thoughtful silence. "Mr. Ward," he asked hesitantly, "did you ever want a family of your own?" The question caught Roman off guard. He glanced at Madeline, who kept her eyes carefully on the trail ahead, then back at Luke's earnest face. Roman started, then paused, struggling to find the right words. The truth was complicated, tied up with old guilt and fears he'd never fully faced. "Reckon there was a time I thought about it," he finally said. "Life had other plans." Luke nodded solemnly, as if he understood far more than Roman had actually said. The boy's quiet acceptance made Roman's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. They reached the church settlement just as dusk was gathering. Roman had intended to push on to his cabin, but dark clouds were building in the west, promising a storm. "Better hole up here tonight," he decided, helping Madeline and the boys down from the wagon. "That weather looks mean." Reverend Porter welcomed them back, offering the church kitchen for a hot supper. The boys helped Porter's wife set the table, while Madeline stirred a pot of bean soup. Roman watched from the doorway, struck by how natural they looked together, like a real family sharing an evening meal. After the boys were settled in their bunks, Madeline joined Roman on the kitchen porch. The wind was picking up, carrying the first cold drops of rain. "I need to tell you something," she said softly, wrapping her shawl tighter. "About the boys." Roman waited, hearing the emotion in her voice. "Since their father died, they've been so careful around men. Scared, really. Even good men who tried to help us." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But with you, it's different. They feel safe with you, especially Luke. I haven't seen him this peaceful since before we lost his father." Roman gripped the porch railing, glad for the darkness that hid his face. The trust of these boys, this makeshift family that had landed on his doorstep, stirred something in him he'd thought long dead. "I'm not," he started roughly, then cleared his throat. "I'm not the safest person to trust." "Maybe," Madeline agreed quietly. "But you're the right person. I believe that now." Thunder rolled across the valley, and the rain began in earnest. Roman stood silent, listening to the storm's approach, feeling the wind change. Everything was changing, it seemed. The threats to the valley, his solitary life, the walls he'd built around his heart. None of it was as solid as he'd thought. Inside, he could hear the boys settling down for sleep, their soft voices mixing with the sound of rain on the roof. Tomorrow they'd head back to his mountain cabin. But tonight, in this moment, he allowed himself to feel the warmth of being part of something larger than his own carefully ordered existence. The storm grew stronger, rattling the windows and forcing them inside. Roman checked the doors were secure, then took his place on a bunk near the entrance. The night ahead would be long, but for the first time in years, he didn't mind the waiting. There was something worth protecting here, something more precious than his solitude. Through the darkness, he heard Jonah's sleepy voice. "Good night, Mr. Ward." "Good night, boy," he answered softly, his voice rough with unspoken emotion. The storm raged outside, but inside the bunkhouse, 3 steady breaths joined his own in the darkness, creating a rhythm that felt surprisingly like home. Dawn broke clear and cold after the storm, painting the church settlement in fresh morning light. Roman stood at the wagon, methodically checking the harness straps while frost crunched under his boots. The boys helped load supplies, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. "Best get moving," Roman said, lifting Jonah onto the wagon seat. "Trail'll be muddy from the rain. Make for slow going." Madeline nodded, wrapping a borrowed quilt tighter around her shoulders. "Thank you, Reverend Porter," she called to the preacher, who stood watching from the church steps. "For everything." "God be with you," Porter replied solemnly. His wife emerged from the kitchen with a basket of fresh biscuits wrapped in cloth, pressing it into Madeline's hands before they departed. The wagon wheels cut deep tracks in the softened earth as they left the settlement behind. Roman kept the horses at a steady pace, ever watchful of the terrain. The storm had changed the landscape. New rivulets carved paths down the hillsides, and fallen branches littered the trail. "Look there," Roman said, pointing to a patch of mud beside the trail. "What do you boys make of that?" Luke and Jonah leaned forward, studying the ground intently. "Tracks?" Luke ventured. "That's right." Roman nodded approvingly. "Cougar passed through here, probably just before dawn. See how the prints are sharp, not worn down by the rain?" The boy's eyes widened with excitement and a touch of fear. Madeline tensed slightly, but Roman continued calmly. "Nothing to worry about. They usually keep their distance. But it's good to know what's around you. The mountain tells stories, if you know how to read them." Throughout the morning, Roman pointed out more signs: deer trails, rabbit runs, the remnants of an eagle's meal. The boys absorbed every detail, their initial nervousness giving way to genuine curiosity. Even Jonah, typically the quieter of the two, began asking questions. "Listen," Roman said as they paused to rest the horses near midday. A low rumble echoed from the slopes above. "That's snow shifting. Warm sun on the fresh powder makes it restless. Stay alert for sounds like that. Could mean avalanche weather." They shared a simple lunch of Porter's biscuits and dried venison, the food tasting better in the clean mountain air. Roman noticed how the boys sat closer to him than before, their guard lowering bit by bit. Even Madeline seemed more at ease, though shadows still lingered in her eyes. The afternoon brought steeper trails and slower progress. Roman walked beside the wagon on the sharper inclines, leading the horses carefully around patches of ice. The sun was low in the sky when they finally caught sight of his cabin. "Thank goodness," Madeline sighed, relief clear in her voice. Roman understood. After days of uncertainty, the cabin represented safety, however temporary. A quick inspection showed everything undisturbed. Roman got a fire going while Madeline and the boys brought in supplies. Soon, the cabin filled with warmth and the smell of cooking. "Beans ain't much," Roman apologized, setting out tin plates. "But there's plenty of them." "We're grateful," Madeline said softly, "for everything." The boys ate hungrily, their eyes growing heavy as the evening deepened. Roman showed them how to bank the fire properly before they settled into their makeshift beds near the hearth. Only after their breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep did Madeline speak again, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something you should know," she said, moving closer to where Roman sat by the table. "About why we're running." Roman waited silently, sensing the weight of what was coming. "My husband, the boy's father, he wasn't just another victim of frontier violence." Madeline's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her cup. "Vern Caro killed him, shot him down over 3 horses he claimed were stolen." Roman's jaw tightened. "Were they?" "No." Madeline's voice held both pain and anger. "Thomas, my husband, he was honest to a fault. Those horses were properly bought and paid for. But Caro wanted them. And what Caro wants—" She trailed off, fighting tears. "He takes," Roman finished grimly. Madeline nodded. "He shot Thomas in front of Luke. My boy saw everything. That's why he's so—" She wiped her eyes. "That's why he's different now. Quieter. Careful." Roman's hands clenched into fists under the table. The thought of Luke witnessing such violence stirred a deep rage in him, but he kept his voice steady. "How long ago?" 8 months. Madeline stared into the fire. "We tried staying on our place, but Caro's men kept coming around, making threats, saying they'd take the boys if I didn't help them find you." She looked at Roman directly. "I'm sorry for lying. About them being yours. I didn't know what else to do." "You did what you had to," Roman said quietly. "To protect them." A long silence fell between them, broken only by the pop and crackle of the fire. Finally, Roman spoke again, his voice rough with remembered pain. "Reckon it's time you knew my story, too. Why I quit making rifles." He paused, gathering courage for words he'd never spoken aloud. "Last gun I built. It was special. A long-range rifle like nothing else made, meant for hunting, not killing men. Madeline listened intently as Roman continued. Sold it to a man I thought I knew, trusted. But he traded it to others, and they... Roman's voice caught. They used it to shoot a child, 10 years old, playing in his own yard, 200 yards from where they aimed. Such a distance. They probably never even saw his face clear. "Oh, Roman," Madeline breathed, her hand moving instinctively toward his before stopping short. "When I heard, I swore never to make another rifle. Destroyed my tools, my patterns, everything." He looked at his calloused hands. "These hands made that possible. That death. I won't ever forget that." Instead of the judgment or fear he expected, Madeline's eyes held only compassion. "You can't carry guilt for others' evil choices," she said softly. "Can't I?" Roman's voice was bitter. "My skill made it possible, my work in their hands. And my husband's honest dealing got him killed. Does that make it his fault?" The question hung in the air between them. Roman had no answer. "We all carry weights we didn't choose," Madeline continued gently. "But that doesn't mean we have to carry them alone." Something shifted in Roman's chest, a loosening of a knot he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. He opened his mouth to respond, but a sound from outside froze the words in his throat. "Stay here," he whispered, rising slowly. "Keep the boys quiet if they wake." Moving silently to the door, Roman lifted his lantern and stepped outside. The night air bit cold and sharp as he moved carefully around the cabin's perimeter. Near the woodpile, the lantern light caught something that made his blood run cold. Fresh boot prints in the mud, no more than an hour old. The tracks told their own story. At least 2 men had stood there, watching the cabin, watching his family. Roman caught himself at that thought. Not his family, but people he'd sworn to protect nonetheless. People who trusted him, despite knowing his past. People who needed him now more than ever. Inside, Madeline waited by the door, her face questioning. Roman nodded grimly. "They're close," he said simply. "Closer than we thought." The fire popped loudly, making them both jump. By the hearth, the boys slept on, unaware of the danger that had crept so near to their sanctuary. Roman watched them for a long moment, thinking of Luke's witnessed tragedy, of Jonah's quiet trust, of Madeline's courage in seeking him out. The tracks outside were a message. Kara was done waiting. Soon, very soon, Roman would have to decide, keep running or stand and fight. But looking at the sleeping boys, he realized the decision was already made. Some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for. Roman crouched by the woodpile, studying the boot prints in the mud. The deep impressions still held crisp edges, no more than 2 or 3 hours old. His trained eye picked out details. 2 different sets of boots, one with a broken heel that left an uneven mark. They'd stood here watching, probably during supper when the cabin's windows glowed brightest. Moving carefully around the perimeter, he found more signs: a freshly broken branch, trampled grass where they'd tied their horses, even a still warm tobacco plug dropped in their haste to leave. These weren't just random scouts. They were Caro's men, methodically closing in. Back inside, Roman found Madeline waiting anxiously by the door. "How bad?" she whispered. "Bad enough." He moved to where the boys slept peacefully by the hearth. "We need to move them. Now." Madeline nodded, gently shaking Luke's shoulder. "Wake up, sweetheart. Just for a minute." The boy stirred, blinking in confusion. Beside him, Jonah mumbled and rolled over. "Listen carefully," Roman said, keeping his voice low and calm. "We're going to play a game, like hide and seek, but extra quiet. Can you do that?" Both boys nodded, now fully awake. Roman led them to the ladder reaching up to the cabin's loft. "Up you go," he encouraged. "Your ma will help get you settled." While Madeline arranged blankets in the loft, Roman gathered their essential supplies: water, dried meat, extra clothes. He passed these up carefully, along with a small oil lamp turned down low. "Try to sleep if you can," he told them, "but stay quiet no matter what you hear, understand?" Luke's eyes were wide but steady. "Yes, sir." Jonah clutched his brother's hand and nodded. Roman waited until Madeline had the boys settled before outlining his plans. "I'll spend tonight reinforcing the cabin. At first light, we'll head out through Miller's Pass. There's an old trapper's cabin about 8 miles in. Defensible position, good sight lines." "You think they'll come tonight?" Madeline asked. "No, this was just reconnaissance. They'll report back to Caro first." Roman's jaw tightened. "But they'll come. Soon." As dawn broke, Roman began his preparations. He nailed heavy wooden shutters across each window, leaving just enough gap to see approaching riders. The cabin's lone door he reinforced with an extra crossbar, solid enough to withstand considerable force. Throughout the morning, he moved methodically through his tasks. He buried extra supplies in the root cellar, scattered the woodpile to hide their increased fuel usage, and brushed away tracks leading to and from the cabin. To any watching eyes, it needed to appear that he lived alone, following his usual solitary routine. Madeline kept the boys occupied with quiet tasks inside. Luke swept the cabin floor while Jonah carefully folded blankets and packed what they'd need for tomorrow's journey. Their soft voices and steady movements helped maintain an illusion of normalcy, though tension hummed beneath the surface. By afternoon, Roman had done all he could to prepare the cabin's defenses. He checked and rechecked their planned escape route, marking the clearest path through the dense timber. If they had to leave in darkness, they'd need every advantage. "We'll leave at first light," he told Madeline as they shared a simple supper of beans and cornbread. "The horses are ready. Packs are set. We'll travel light and fast." She nodded, her face drawn with worry but determined. "The boys know to be ready. They understand it's important." As evening settled over the mountain, the family retreated to their designated spots. Madeline and the boys in the loft, Roman below by the fire. He'd insisted on keeping watch, though Madeline had offered to take turns. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, a chorus of wolves began their nightly song, their mournful howls echoing across the valley. Roman sat in his chair, methodically running a whetstone along the edge of his axe. The familiar motion was calming, but his thoughts were troubled. The weight of the axe in his hands reminded him of another weight he'd once known well, the careful balance of a precision rifle. His fingers still remembered the smooth wood of gun stocks, the precise angle of sights, the delicate mechanisms he'd spent years perfecting. Never again, he reminded himself firmly. The vow he'd made 10 years ago still held true. He would never forge another gun, never fire another shot. That path led only to death and regret. The axe would have to be enough. It was an honest tool, meant for honest work. If it had to serve as a weapon, at least its purpose would be clear: protecting the innocent, not dealing death from hidden distances. As midnight approached, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Roman sat motionless, listening to the night sounds he knew so well. The soft creak of settling timber, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the occasional hoot of a hunting owl. Then, a sound that didn't belong. A sharp crack, like a dry twig snapping under careless weight. Roman's hand tightened on the axe handle. He didn't move, didn't even turn his head toward the window. But every sense was alert now. straining to catch the slightest indication of movement outside. For long moments, only silence answered. Then, almost too faint to hear, the scrape of leather on stone, someone adjusting their position, watching the cabin through the darkness. Above in the loft, the boys slept on, unaware. Madeline's breathing remained steady and deep. Roman sat motionless in his chair, axe ready across his knees as the night hours crept forward and unseen eyes studied his home. The wolves had gone quiet now. Even they seemed to sense the predators that had invaded their territory. Human predators whose patience and calculation made them far more dangerous than any natural hunter. Roman knew sleep would not come tonight. He would keep his vigil until dawn, protecting these people who had trusted him with their lives. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for now, his task was simple. Stay alert, stay ready, and keep his family safe. Family. The word echoed in his mind, unexpected but somehow right. Somewhere between Madeline's arrival and this moment, these three people had become more than just refugees seeking shelter. They had become something he'd thought forever lost to him. A reason to fight, to hope, to live for more than mere survival. Another twig snapped in the darkness outside. Roman's grip tightened on the axe handle, its newly sharpened edge gleaming dully in the last light of the dying embers. Dawn was still hours away, and somewhere out there, Caro's men were watching, waiting, planning their next move. Tomorrow would bring change, one way or another. But for now, Roman Ward sat guard in his chair, axe ready, as the night deepened around his cabin, and those he had sworn to protect. The winter dawn crept over the mountain with pale fingers of light. Roman stood in the cabin's doorway, studying the pristine snow for fresh tracks. Nothing disturbed the crystalline surface except rabbit prints near the woodpile. Still, he knew better than to trust the peaceful scene. "Time to go," he called softly over his shoulder. Inside, Madeline helped the boys into their warmest clothes, layers of wool and cotton topped with Roman's spare jackets, far too big but better than nothing. Their small faces disappeared into the oversized collars, making them look even younger and more vulnerable. "Remember what I said," Roman instructed as he secured their packs onto a hand sled. "Step exactly where I step. No talking unless absolutely necessary." Luke nodded solemnly while Jonah pressed closer to his mother's side. Madeline wrapped her shawl tighter and gripped the sled's rope handles. Roman led them out through the back of the cabin where an old miner's trail wound up into the timber. Few knew of this path. It had been abandoned decades ago when the silver played out, its entrance now hidden by thick juniper growth. Roman had discovered it years ago while tracking a wounded elk. The morning air bit sharp and clean. Their breath formed white clouds as Roman broke trail, testing each step before putting his full weight down. The crust of snow crackled beneath his boots, unavoidable noise that made him wince. Behind him, the boys followed carefully in his footprints, their small boots landing exactly where his had been. Madeline brought up the rear, pulling the loaded sled. Its runners whispered over the snow, carrying their essential supplies: food, blankets, spare clothes, and Roman's tools. He'd left everything else behind, including his furniture and most of his winter stores. Better to travel light and fast. They climbed steadily through stands of lodgepole pine. Roman kept them close to the tree line, where shadows still lay thick, providing cover. Every few minutes, he would stop and listen, holding up his hand for the others to halt. Each time, they froze in place until he signaled them forward again. By mid-morning, they had covered several miles, following the twisting path deeper into the mountains. Roman led them into a protected canyon where massive granite walls rose on either side. He'd trapped beaver here in previous winters, knowing the deep pools rarely froze completely. "We'll rest here," he said, helping Madeline maneuver the sled into a natural alcove formed by fallen rocks. "Just long enough to catch our breath and have some water." The boys sank gratefully onto a snow-free boulder while Madeline distributed bread and dried apples from their supplies. Roman remained standing, scanning the canyon walls above them. The peaceful moment shattered as the distinct sound of hoofbeats echoed from the ridge. Roman's hand shot up, signaling absolute silence. The boys froze, apple slices halfway to their mouths. The riders passed directly above them, their horses' iron shoes striking rock where the snow had blown clear. Through gaps in the canyon wall, Roman caught glimpses of movement. At least 3 men, maybe more, their dark shapes stark against the winter sky. Minutes crawled by as they waited, barely breathing. Finally, the sounds faded toward the north. Roman relaxed slightly but kept his voice to a whisper. "They're searching the main trails. We need to keep moving." He led them deeper into the canyon, where a series of narrow switchbacks provided the only passage through the cliffs. It was slow going, the path barely wide enough for the sled in places. Roman helped guide it around the sharpest turns, while Madeline and the boys picked their way carefully along the icy track. The afternoon sun had started its descent when they finally emerged onto more level ground. Roman oriented himself quickly, recognizing the distinctive split peak that rose to the southeast. Henry's winter camp lay just beyond, tucked into a protected valley where thermal springs kept the ground mostly free of snow. "Not much further now," he assured them, noting how the boys dragged their feet, and Madeline's face showed signs of strain. They found Henry's camp exactly where Roman expected, a sturdy lodge of timber and canvas nestled against a rocky outcrop. Smoke rose from the central chimney, and several horses dozed in a makeshift corral. Henry himself appeared in the doorway before they reached it. He was a tall man in his mid-40s, his dark hair touched with gray at the temples. His face remained carefully neutral as he watched their approach, but his eyes missed nothing. "Roman Ward," he said simply. "Been some years." "Too many, friend." Roman stepped forward. "We need help." Henry's gaze moved past him to take in Madeline and the boys, their exhausted state clear in every line of their bodies. Without another word, he stepped aside and gestured them into the warmth of his lodge. Inside, the temperature rose considerably thanks to a small but efficient stove. Furs lined the walls, and neat bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters. Henry motioned them to sit on blanket-covered benches while he poured hot tea into tin cups. Roman waited until the boys had their hands wrapped around the warm cups before explaining their situation. He spoke plainly, knowing Henry preferred direct truth to careful words. "Caro's gang is hunting us. They want me to build them a rifle, a special one. They're holding a valley rancher hostage to force my hand." Henry nodded slowly. "I have heard of this Caro. He deals with corrupt Indian agents, steals water rights from both settlers and tribal lands." His dark eyes settled on Madeline. "These are not your children?" "No," she admitted. "But Caro killed their father. He'll kill them too if he finds us." "The boys need safe passage," Roman added. "We all do. I thought maybe you could help guide us to safer ground tomorrow." Henry was quiet for a long moment, studying the fire. Roman knew he was weighing more than just the request. There were tribal politics to consider, old treaties, complex relationships between the Ute people and their white neighbors. Finally, Henry looked up. "I will help. Not just for old friendship, though I remember how your father treated my people fairly. I help because Caro threatens all who live in these mountains, white and Ute alike. His greed knows no boundaries." Relief swept through Roman. Henry was more than just a skilled tracker. He was a respected voice among his people and knew every hidden trail for 50 miles around. With his help, their chances of reaching safety increased dramatically. The rest of the evening passed in relative peace. Henry shared a simple but filling stew of dried meat and roots. The boys, exhausted from the day's journey, soon fell asleep on a pile of furs in the corner. Madeline sat near them, her own eyes growing heavy as the warmth and safety of the lodge worked their gentle magic. Roman and Henry spoke quietly by the fire, planning tomorrow's route. They would need to avoid the main trails completely now. Caro's men would be watching those. Henry knew less traveled paths that would take them east, toward settlements where Caro had less influence. As the fire burned low, Roman felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders. For the first time since Madeline and the boys had arrived at his cabin, he allowed himself to believe they might actually survive this. Looking at the sleeping family, for that's what they had become, whether he'd intended it or not, he silently thanked whatever fate had led them to his door. Henry seemed to read his thoughts. "They are good people," he said softly. "Worth protecting." Roman nodded, unable to find words for the mix of emotions in his chest. Instead, he watched the flames dance lower, listening to the quiet breathing of his sleeping charges and the gentle winter wind outside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, they were safe. It was enough. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale winter colors as the group prepared to leave Henry's camp. Roman helped Madeline secure their few remaining supplies, while Henry saddled 3 horses, all he could spare without leaving himself stranded. The boys huddled near the dying fire, finishing the last of their morning tea, their breath visible in the crisp mountain air. "The settlement lies 4 days north," Roman explained, spreading a worn map across his knee. "If we push hard, we might make it in 3. He traced the route with his finger, showing Madeline where they would need to cross several rivers and navigate steep passes. Henry nodded gravely. "The ice will be thick on the rivers. We must be cautious." They set out as the sun cleared the mountain peaks, Henry leading the way with Roman bringing up the rear. Madeline rode in the middle with Jonah seated in front of her, while Luke shared Roman's mount. The 3rd horse carried their essential supplies. The morning passed slowly as they picked their way through dense stands of pine and aspen. Snow crunched beneath the horses' hooves, and occasionally a branch would crack overhead, releasing a shower of powder. The boys remained unusually quiet, seeming to understand the gravity of their situation. By mid-morning, they reached the first major obstacle, a wide river that cut through the valley like a silver ribbon. Ice had formed along the banks, but the center still flowed swift and dark. Henry dismounted to study the crossing. "Too dangerous here," he announced after a few minutes. "The ice is thin and the current is strong. We must find another way." The detour cost them precious time. They had to backtrack nearly 2 miles before finding a safer crossing point where the river narrowed and large rocks created natural stepping stones. Even then, the crossing proved treacherous. The horses picked their way carefully across the slippery rocks, while everyone held their breath. Jonah clutched Madeline's arm tightly as their horse navigated the crossing. "Mama," he whispered, "I'm scared." "Just hold on tight, sweetheart," she soothed, keeping her own voice steady despite her white-knuckled grip on the reins. "We're almost there." By early afternoon, the horses showed signs of fatigue. Their pace had slowed considerably as the terrain became more challenging, and Roman could see the strain in their labored breathing. "There's an old line shack ahead," Henry said, pointing to a ridge about half a mile distant. "Used by trappers in better days. We can rest there." The line shack proved to be a simple one-room structure built of rough-hewn logs, its roof slightly sagging but still sound. Roman helped everyone dismount while Henry tended to the horses, leading them to a sheltered spot where they could rest. "The roof needs work," Roman observed, noting several loose boards. "Boys, want to help me fix it?" Luke and Jonah eagerly followed Roman's instructions, happy to have something useful to do. He showed them how to test boards for stability and replace the ones that had worked loose over the years of mountain winters. "Careful with that hammer, Jonah," Roman cautioned, steadying the boy's arm. "Aim true and let the weight of the head do the work." Inside the shack, Madeline took stock of their remaining provisions. She had enough dried meat and beans for a modest meal, supplemented with the last of their bread. As she worked, she could hear the boys' laughter mixing with the steady rhythm of hammering overhead. While the boys worked with Roman, Jonah had been secretly whittling away at a small piece of wood he'd picked up during their journey. Now, as the roof repairs neared completion, he pulled the carved token from his pocket. "Mr. Roman?" Jonah approached shyly, holding out his handiwork. "I made this for you?" Roman carefully took the small wooden piece. It was rough carved, but clearly made with great care. A simple figure that might have been a horse, or perhaps a wolf. The gesture caught him off guard, and he had to clear his throat before speaking. "This is fine work, Jonah," he said softly, running his thumb over the carving's smooth surface. "Thank you." The boy beamed with pride, and for a moment the tension of their situation eased. Even Luke smiled, a rare sight these days. The peaceful moment was short-lived. As dusk approached, Henry returned from his scouting circuit, his expression grave. He gestured for Roman to join him outside, away from the others. "They found our trail," Henry said without preamble. "At the river crossing. 3 riders, maybe more behind them. They're moving fast." Roman's jaw tightened. "How close?" "Too close. They'll reach this valley by tomorrow noon unless we move." Roman glanced back at the line shack, where lamplight now glowed through the single window. Inside, he could see Madeline serving the boys their simple supper, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy in their desperate flight. "We'll have to leave before sunrise," Roman decided, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "Cut across the high country instead of following the valley." Henry's expression remained neutral, but Roman knew what his friend was thinking. The high country was treacherous this time of year, steep, rocky, and exposed to bitter winds. It would slow their progress significantly, especially with the boys. "It's dangerous," Henry said simply. "More dangerous than Caro catching us?" Henry conceded the point with a slight nod. "We should tell them now. Give them time to rest before the hard journey tomorrow." Inside the line shack, Roman broke the news as gently as possible. Madeline's face paled, but she nodded resolutely. The boys, picking up on the adults' tension, grew quiet and serious. "Try to sleep," Roman told them all. "Tomorrow will test us hard." As the others settled down for the night, Roman took first watch, positioning himself near the door where he could see both approaches to the shack. The wooden token Jonah had given him rested in his pocket, a tangible reminder of what was at stake. The night settled around them, clear and cold. Stars wheeled overhead, their light reflecting off the snow and casting everything in pale shadows. Roman listened to the quiet breathing of his charges, each sound precious now that he knew how close danger lurked. Tomorrow would push them to their limits, but they had no choice. As the temperature dropped and the wind picked up, Roman silently prayed they would have the strength for what lay ahead. The darkness before dawn held a bitter chill. Roman roused the family while stars still glittered overhead, his movements careful to mask the stiffness in his joints from the cold night. Inside the line shack, Madeline helped the boys pull on extra layers of clothing, while Henry prepared a quick breakfast of hard biscuits and dried meat. "Eat what you can," Roman advised softly. "We've got hard climbing ahead." Luke and Jonah huddled close to the dying embers of their fire, shoulders touching as they shared the last of their warm tea. Neither boy complained about the early hour or the meager meal. Roman noticed how they'd grown leaner during their flight, their young faces more serious than any child's should be. They set out just as the eastern sky began to pale. Henry took point, leading them away from the line shack and up toward the high passes. The horses moved slowly, picking their way through loose shale and patches of ice. Roman brought up the rear, scanning their back trail for any sign of pursuit. The wind grew stronger as they climbed, whistling through the bare branches of stunted pines that clung to the mountainside. By mid-morning, the gusts were sharp enough to sting their faces and set the horses to dancing nervously on the narrow trail. "Stay close to the wall," Roman called out, watching as Madeline guided her mount past a particularly exposed section. Jonah sat in front of her, small hands wrapped tightly in the horse's mane. The trail switched back and forth across the face of the mountain, each turn bringing them higher into the biting wind. Luke rode double with Roman, and he could feel the boy's tension in how tightly he gripped the saddle horn. "You're doing fine," Roman reassured him quietly. "Just keep your eyes forward." Near midday, they reached a long ledge that curved around the mountain's shoulder. The drop to their left was steep enough to make the stomach lurch. Henry held up his hand for them to halt, studying the ridge ahead with narrow eyes. Roman saw it too, movement on the far ridge. Sunlight glinted off something metal. "Get down," he ordered sharply, already sliding from his saddle and pulling Luke with him. "Against the wall, quick!" The crack of gunfire split the mountain quiet. Bullets whined off rocks, sending chips flying. Madeline had barely gotten Jonah to the ground when a second volley rang out. "It's Caro's men," Henry confirmed grimly, drawing his rifle. "At least 4 of them on that ridge." Roman pressed the boys flat against the cliff face, using his body as a shield. The ledge offered minimal cover, barely 3 feet of width between the sheer drop and the rock wall. Henry returned fire, careful shots meant to keep the attackers' heads down rather than hit them. "There's a gully," Henry called out between shots. 50 yards back. We might make it if we move now." Roman nodded. "Madeline, take the boys. Stay low. We'll cover you." She gathered Luke and Jonah close, her face pale but determined. "Run when I tell you," she whispered to them. "Don't look back. Just run." More shots cracked across the gap. Henry's return fire gave them their moment. "Now!" Roman ordered. Madeline and the boys darted back along the ledge, half crouched. Roman's heart hammered as he watched them, expecting any moment to hear the worst. But they made it to the gully's mouth, scrambling down over loose rocks. "Go," Roman told Henry. "I'll be right behind you." He waited until his friend was halfway to safety before starting his own retreat. That's when the bullet found him. It felt like a hammer blow to his left side, just below his ribs. The impact spun him partway around, and for a terrifying moment he teetered at the ledge's edge. Somehow he kept his feet, staggering forward. Pain bloomed hot and sharp, but Roman forced it down. He couldn't afford to be hurt, not now. The gully waited ahead, promising shelter. He half ran, half slid down the steep incline, loose stones clattering around him. "Roman!" Madeline's frightened voice reached him as he stumbled to the bottom. Her eyes went wide at the sight of blood on his coat. "It's nothing," he said quickly, though the words came through clenched teeth. "Just a graze. We need to keep moving." Henry studied him with knowing eyes but said nothing. Above them, voices carried on the wind, Caro's men, deciding whether to follow their quarry down the treacherous slope. They retrieved the horses, which had followed their riders' retreat and pushed on through the afternoon. The gully led them down and away from their pursuers, but the going was rough. They had to pick their way over fallen rocks and around patches of ice. Roman felt every step, but he kept his face carefully neutral. The boys were watching him too closely for him to show weakness now. Still, by late afternoon, he could feel fever starting to build, and his vision occasionally blurred at the edges. "There," Henry pointed as the light began to fail. "Cave entrance, up there in those rocks." It was more of a shallow overhang than a true cave, but it would have to do. They led the horses into a sheltered pocket nearby and removed their tack. Madeline got the boys settled, while Henry gathered what dry wood he could find. "Let me see it," Madeline said quietly, once the boys were occupied with helping Henry build a small fire. Roman started to protest, but she fixed him with a stern look. "You're pale as chalk, and you've been favoring that side for hours. Let me see." Reluctantly, he allowed her to help him ease his coat off. The wound was an angry furrow along his ribs, still seeping blood. Madeline cleaned it as best she could with water from their canteens and bound it with strips torn from her petticoat. "You should have said something sooner," she scolded softly. "Didn't want to frighten the boys." Roman managed a weak smile. "Besides, we couldn't have stopped anyway." As if to emphasize his point, voices echoed through the canyon, distant but clear in the still evening air. Caro's men were still searching, working their way down from the ridge. Luke and Jonah pressed close to Roman, one on either side. He could feel them trembling slightly, but they remained quiet, understanding the need for silence. "Try to rest," he told them, including Madeline in his glance. "We'll need to move again at first light." The boys nodded solemnly. Jonah's small hand found Roman's larger one and held on tight. On his other side, Luke leaned against his shoulder, careful to avoid the injured side. Darkness settled fully over the mountains. The tiny fire Henry had built was more for warmth than light, carefully screened to prevent it from being seen from below. Its soft glow showed worried faces all around. Roman fought to stay alert despite the fever he could feel building. The wound throbbed in time with his heartbeat, but he forced himself to focus on their situation. They would need to change direction tomorrow, find some way to throw off their pursuers. More voices drifted up from the canyon, closer now. Someone in Caro's gang was arguing about splitting up to search different routes. Roman felt Jonah's grip tighten on his hand. "It's all right," he whispered, though he knew it wasn't. "They won't find us up here in the dark." Henry moved silently to the cave's entrance, rifle ready. Madeline drew the boys closer to her, one arm around each of them. The voices continued to carry through the night air, sometimes fading, sometimes growing nearer. Roman pressed his free hand against his bandaged side, willing the pain to subside. They couldn't afford for him to be weak now, not with so many lives depending on him. The boys' trust, Madeline's faith in him, Henry's loyalty, all of it weighed on him as heavily as the wound in his side. The night stretched on, marked by the slow wheeling of stars across the slice of sky visible from their shelter. Below, Caro's men continued their search, their voices a reminder that danger hadn't passed. It had only paused. Roman knew that tomorrow would test them all again, but for now, in this moment, he could only hold on to Jonah's small hand, feel Luke's quiet breathing against his shoulder, and pray for strength to see them through whatever lay ahead. Dawn crept over the mountains with bitter fingers of frost. Roman woke to find his injured side had stiffened overnight, the bandages crusty with dried blood. Every breath brought a sharp reminder of yesterday's bullet. He tried to sit up quietly, not wanting to wake the others. but couldn't quite suppress a grunt of pain. "Let me check that wound," Madeline whispered, already awake and moving to his side. The boys still slept, huddled together under shared blankets. Henry stirred from his watch position near the cave's mouth. Frost had gathered on his wool coat during the night. "Storm's coming," he said softly, nodding toward the slate-gray sky. "We need to move before it hits." Roman submitted to Madeline's gentle examination, though his jaw tightened as she peeled back the bandage. Her fingers felt cool against his fevered skin. "It's angry," she murmured, "and hot to the touch." She reached for her gathering bag, pulling out a small pouch of herbs. "I can make a poultice, but it won't help much if we're moving all day." "No choice," Roman replied, easing his shirt back down. "We can't stay here." Henry moved closer, crouching beside them. "I know a way," he said, his voice low and measured. "There's a deep canyon, cuts through the backbone of these hills, leads right to where I suspect Caro's made his camp." "You want us to go toward them?" Madeline's voice rose slightly before she caught herself. "They won't expect it," Henry explained. "The route I'm thinking of, it comes in from behind their likely position. Most folks don't even know it exists." Roman considered this as he slowly got to his feet, using the cave wall for support. The wound pulled with every movement, but he forced himself to stand straight. "How far?" "We could reach the canyon by noon," Henry said. "If we push hard, maybe get close to their camp by nightfall." Luke stirred then, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "Are we leaving?" he asked, his young voice thick with sleep. Beside him, Jonah blinked awake as well. "Yes," Roman answered, trying to keep his voice steady despite the pain. "We need to eat quick and get moving." They shared a cold breakfast of dried meat and hard biscuits, no one wanting to risk a fire. The morning air bit through their clothes as they gathered their gear and led the horses out of their shelter. The group moved slowly at first, picking their way down steep switchbacks. Roman's injury made mounting up impossible. He had to walk, each step jarring his wound. The boys stayed close, watching him with worried eyes. By mid-morning, snow began to fall, fat, wet flakes that clung to everything. Their breath came out in white puffs, and conversation dwindled to necessary words only. Roman found himself leaning more heavily on his walking stick with each passing hour. Just before noon, they reached the canyon Henry had spoken of. The walls dropped away sharply on either side, creating a deep gash in the earth. Snow gathered in drifts along the rim, softening every sound. "We need to rest," Madeline said firmly, noting how Roman's face had gone gray with pain and exhaustion. They found a sheltered spot among some rocks, and Madeline insisted on changing Roman's bandages. While she worked, he finally voiced the fear that had been growing since yesterday. "Caro wants more than just revenge," he told her quietly, while Henry kept watch and the boys gathered dry kindling. "He wants me to start forging guns again. That's why he's doing this, trying to force my hand." "The boys," Madeline whispered, understanding dawning in her eyes. "He'll use them as leverage." Roman nodded grimly. "He knows I won't risk their lives. Probably figures threatening them will make me break my vow never to make another weapon." "We won't let him," Madeline said fiercely, tying off the fresh bandage with perhaps more force than necessary. They pressed on through the afternoon, descending deeper into the canyon. The snow continued to fall, coating the ground in thick white that muffled their footsteps. The walls of rock rose higher on either side until only a narrow strip of gray sky was visible above. Henry led them surely, though the path, if it could be called that, seemed to disappear entirely in places. Sometimes they had to backtrack around fallen boulders or patches of treacherous ice. The horses grew increasingly nervous in the confined space, and more than once they had to stop to calm them. Roman felt the fever rising as the day wore on, but he forced himself to keep moving. Each step was an exercise in will, but he refused to show weakness. The boys were watching, always watching, and he wouldn't add to their fears. As dusk approached, Henry found them a defensible spot beneath a rocky overhang. The space was tight, but it offered protection from the snow and would hide any small fire they might risk. "We're close now," Henry said as they settled in. "Maybe 2 hours from where I think their camp is, assuming I'm right about the location." Madeline got the boys settled with their meager supper, then came to where Roman sat, propped against the rock wall. Without a word, she pressed her hand to his forehead. "You're burning up," she said softly, real fear in her voice. "I'll manage," he assured her, though the words felt hollow even to him. "You can't face Caro like this," she pleaded. "Let Henry and me find another way. We could try to reach the fort, or—" "No," Roman cut her off gently. "We're out of options, Madeline. Caro won't stop. He'll keep hunting, keep using innocent people as pawns until he gets what he wants." He caught her hand in his. "I won't let him hurt those boys. Or you. And I won't let you sacrifice yourself," she said fiercely. "Those boys need you. She stopped, biting back whatever she'd been about to say. Roman squeezed her hand. "I promise you," he said, meeting her worried gaze. "I won't abandon any of you. But we have to end this. Tomorrow, one way or another, it has to end." Luke and Jonah came over then, carrying their empty tin plates. They settled down on either side of Roman, as had become their habit. Neither boy spoke, but their presence said everything about their trust in him. The snow continued to fall outside their shelter, coating the canyon in deepening white. Henry took first watch, his figure a dark outline against the pale landscape. The boys gradually dozed off, their small bodies warm against Roman's sides. Madeline had just finished reheating some coffee over their tiny fire when they saw them, pinpricks of light moving through the trees on the canyon rim above, lanterns bobbing in the darkness. Caro's men had found their trail again. "Wake the boys," Roman whispered urgently. "We need to move, now." But as they hurried to gather their things, more lights appeared, coming from both directions along the canyon. They were surrounded, trapped in the very canyon that was supposed to be their secret route. Roman met Henry's eyes across the dying fire. Both men knew tomorrow's confrontation had just become today's. There would be no more running. The lantern lights drew closer, like predatory fireflies in the snowy dark. Roman pulled the boys close, feeling their trembling bodies against him. Whatever came next, he knew with bone-deep certainty that he would do anything to keep them safe. He looked at Madeline, saw the same fierce determination in her eyes. They weren't finished yet. Morning might bring violence, but it would also bring an end to running. One way or another, as he'd told Madeline, this had to end. The lights continued their slow approach through the falling snow, and the night pressed in around their small shelter. Roman's wound throbbed with his racing heart, but he forced himself to stay alert, to stay ready. Tomorrow was coming, whether they wanted it or not, and with it would come the final confrontation with Caro and his men. Dawn crept over the mountains in pale strips of light. Henry led them through stands of thick pine, their boots crunching on patches of crusty snow. Roman's wound burned with each step, but he forced himself to keep pace. The boys stayed close to Madeline, their faces drawn with exhaustion. They'd barely slept, spending most of the night moving through the darkness to escape the lantern lights. "Tracks getting harder to follow," Henry muttered, studying the ground. "Too many crossing trails." A twig snapped sharply to their left, then another to their right. Roman's heart sank as he realized the truth. They were surrounded. The first shots cracked through the morning air. Splinters flew from a nearby tree trunk. "Run!" Roman shouted to Madeline and the boys. "Henry, get them out of here!" Henry grabbed Madeline's arm, pulling her and the children toward a thicket. Roman turned to face their attackers, knowing he had to buy them time. His injured side screamed in protest as he dove behind a fallen log. More gunfire erupted. Roman tried to move to better cover, but his wound had stiffened overnight. His reactions were too slow. Strong hands seized him from behind, throwing him roughly to the ground. "Got him!" a voice called out. Shouts echoed through the trees, followed by the sound of struggling. Roman's heart clenched as he heard Jonah cry out in fear. "Bring them here," came a commanding voice, Caro's voice. Moments later, 2 of Caro's men dragged Madeline and the boys back into view. Henry was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps he'd escaped, or worse. Luke and Jonah pressed against their mother, trembling. "Time for games is over," Caro said, stepping into view. He was a tall man with cold eyes. "You'll all march nice and quiet to my camp now. Anyone tries running, the boys pay the price." They traveled for hours, pushed along rough trails until the sun hung low in the western sky. Finally, they reached a crude fortress built into a canyon wall, a maze of connected chambers reinforced with heavy timbers. Inside, Caro turned to Roman. "Simple choice now. You forge me that rifle, or the boys suffer." "No," Roman said hoarsely. "I won't make weapons again." Caro's face hardened. "Take the boys to the back chamber," he ordered his men. "Maybe some time apart will help change minds." "No!" Madeline lurched forward as Luke and Jonah were pulled away. One of Caro's men caught her arms, holding her back. The boys' frightened faces disappeared into the shadows of a rough-hewn tunnel. Roman sagged against the wall, the weight of failure crushing him. He had promised to protect them, to keep them safe. Now they were prisoners, and it was his fault. The family he had grown to love was at Caro's mercy, and he seemed powerless to save them. Roman slumped against the rough timber walls of the storeroom, his injured side throbbing. Moonlight filtered through cracks between the logs, casting thin silver lines across the dirt floor. The emptiness pressed in around him, heavy as mountain stone. For the first time in 30 years, Roman felt the desperate urge to pray. He closed his eyes, words coming slowly at first, then rushing out like spring snowmelt. "Lord," he whispered, "I ain't asked for nothing since Sarah died, but them boys need help. Show me the way." A soft scraping sound made Roman freeze. One of the wall logs shifted slightly, and a familiar shadow slipped through the gap. "Henry," Roman breathed, relief flooding through him. "Guards change every 2 hours," Henry whispered, working at the rope binding Roman's hands. "Getting sloppy already, celebrating their victory with whiskey." As the ropes fell away, Roman rubbed his wrists. "Did you see where they're keeping Madeline and the boys?" "East chamber. 2 men watching." Henry's eyes glinted in the darkness. "But we need more than just quick hands to get them out." Roman's mind raced, years of gunsmith training clicking into place like well-oiled parts. "Caro wants me to forge his rifle. Maybe we can use that." "How?" "My old tools include black powder for testing charges. Scatter enough around." Roman's voice trailed off meaningfully. Henry nodded slowly. "Create confusion. Cover for escape. I'll go back to Caro, tell him I'll do it. While I set up the workshop, you find a way to reach Madeline and the boys." "Dangerous game," Henry warned. "Ain't got no choice." Roman squared his shoulders. "Help me look beat down again." Henry retied Roman's hands loosely, then slipped back through the wall. Roman waited until the next guard check, then called out hoarsely, "Tell Caro I want to talk." Minutes later, Roman stood before Caro in the main chamber. "I'll forge your rifle," he said, letting defeat color his voice. "But I need my old tools. Everything's exact with gunsmithing." Caro's smile was cold as winter. "Finally seeing sense, are you?" He gestured to one of his men. "Get his toolbox from the wagon." Roman began arranging his workbench in the shed they provided, carefully spilling small amounts of powder as he sorted through tools and supplies. His hands remembered every motion, though his heart ached at touching these instruments again. The heating flames sputtered to life beneath his small forge. As the first sparks rose, Roman watched them dance against the darkness. Not sparks of defeat this time, but of hope. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the workshop windows as Roman worked methodically at the forge. Caro loomed nearby, arms crossed, watching every movement with predatory intensity. The metal barrel blank glowed orange-hot in the flames, far hotter than proper forging required. "Ain't you overheating that steel?" Caro asked suspiciously. "Takes special tempering for a long-range barrel," Roman replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. He positioned the metal just so, knowing the scattered powder trails led to larger caches hidden beneath wood shavings. The barrel blank sparked violently. In that instant, Roman dropped to the floor as flames raced along the powder lines. The explosion rocked the hideout, sending tools and timber flying. Smoke filled the workshop as secondary charges ignited, creating the chaos Roman had planned. Through the confusion, Henry's shadow moved swift as a mountain cat. The sounds of splintering wood and surprised shouts told Roman his friend had reached Madeline and the boys. Roman heard Jonah's frightened cry turn to relief. "Henry!" "This way!" Henry's calm voice guided them through the smoke. Caro burst through the haze, his face twisted with fury. He thrust a revolver toward Roman. "Pick it up!" he snarled, kicking a fallen gun across the floor. Roman stood his ground. "No." "Pick it up and fight, coward!" "I made my peace with God," Roman said quietly. "I ain't breaking that vow." Caro lunged forward with a roar. Roman sidestepped, using the bigger man's momentum to send him staggering. They grappled near the workshop's edge, where fire-weakened support beams groaned overhead. Roman broke free, ducking as Caro's wild punch split the air. The timing had to be perfect. Roman waited until Caro charged again, then rolled aside. The floor timbers, eaten by flames, gave way beneath Caro's feet. With a shocked cry, he plunged through splintering wood into a deep snowdrift below. Rifle shots cracked through the canyon. "United States Cavalry!" voices shouted. Henry's message had gotten through. The remaining gang members, seeing their leader defeated, threw down their weapons. "Roman!" Madeline's voice cut through the settling smoke. She ran to him, tears streaming down her face, her arms wrapped around him fiercely. "Pa!" Luke and Jonah broke free from Henry's protective grip. They crashed into Roman's legs, holding tight. The word "Pa" rang in Roman's ears, sweet as spring water, healing as mountain air. Roman gathered all three close, his own eyes damp with gratitude. He had kept his vow. He had protected his family. And somehow, through God's grace, he had found his way home. The morning sun painted the eastern mountains gold as Roman guided the wagon down from Caro's defeated stronghold. His wounded arm ached, but the precious cargo of his newfound family made the discomfort worthwhile. Madeline sat beside him on the iho bench while Luke and Jonah dozed in the wagon bed, wrapped in warm blankets. Henry rode alongside on his pony, alert for any lingering trouble. The journey was slow but peaceful. Roman found himself watching the boys in the back of the wagon, still amazed at how quickly they had claimed space in his heart. Every few miles, Jonah would wake and point out interesting rocks or trees. his enthusiasm untouched by their recent ordeal. Luke remained quieter, but kept close to his brother, his young face showing relief that their running was finally over. By early afternoon, the small valley settlement came into view. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the white-painted church steeple stood tall against the mountains. As they approached, townspeople emerged from shops and houses, gathering to welcome them. Word of Caro's defeat had traveled fast. Reverend Porter hurried down the church steps, his weathered face breaking into a broad smile. "The Lord be praised," he said, helping Madeline down from the wagon. "We've been praying for your safe return." The boys climbed down, staying close to Roman as curious townsfolk gathered around. Someone brought hot coffee and fresh bread from the bakery. Others offered blankets and words of welcome. Roman noticed how the boys stood straighter, no longer hiding from friendly faces. "Reverend," Roman said quietly, drawing Porter aside. "I need to make something official." He glanced at Luke and Jonah, who were accepting cookies from the baker's wife. "Those boys need proper guardianship, legal papers saying they're mine to protect." Porter nodded, understanding. "Come to my study. We'll draft the petitions now." Inside the church office, Porter pulled out the necessary forms. His pen scratched across paper as he recorded dates, names, and circumstances. Roman watched, feeling the weight of this moment. He was choosing responsibility over solitude, love over isolation. As evening approached, the church kitchen filled with warmth and good smells. The ladies of the congregation had prepared a hearty supper: beef stew, cornbread, and apple pie. Roman sat with Madeline and the boys at the long table, Henry beside them, as townsfolk shared the meal and offered blessings. "Time we headed home," Roman said after supper, watching Jonah's eyes grow heavy. The word home felt different now, fuller, richer with meaning. The wagon creaked up the familiar mountain trail in the deepening dusk. Lantern light swayed, casting shadows through the pines. Luke and Jonah stayed awake this time, eager to reach the cabin they already considered home. Roman's cabin appeared through the trees, its dark windows soon to be bright with lamplight. He helped everyone down, carrying their few belongings inside. The boys raced past him, their boots thundering on the wooden floor. "I want the top bunk," Jonah called. "No fair!" Luke chased after him. Madeline paused in the doorway beside Roman. The cabin's familiar sense of wood smoke and pine mingled with the new presence of family. Her eyes met his, full of gratitude and something deeper. "You lived alone for 30 years, she whispered, her voice soft with wonder at the change in his life. Roman smiled gently. But the Lord had other plans. Inside, the boys were already claiming their sleeping space, their excited voices filling corners that had known only silence. Henry nodded farewell, knowing his friend was in good hands. Roman stood for a moment, watching Madeline light the lamps and the boys settle their belongings. Then he stepped inside and closed the heavy wooden door behind him. The sound was familiar, but everything else had changed. Where there had been emptiness, there was now fullness. Where there had been regret, there was redemption. Where there had been solitude, there was family. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.